Hi, Joshua. It's nice to meet you. If you could please introduce yourself before we go forward, that'd be great.
Brilliant. Thank you, Miriam. It's a pleasure to be interviewed by you today, and it's a real pleasure to talk to people all over the world who are interested in these issues. My name is Joshua Castellino. I'm professor of law, and I'm dean of the School of Law and the Business School at Middlesex University in London, UK.
Amazing. Just for everyone else, my name is Miriam, and I am a SDSN project officer. So in terms of just moving forward, I will be asking Joshua a few questions, as well as the audience will have an opportunity to ask questions live. And then if there are any questions, I will go forward with that. So first question. So in regards to human rights, so something that I'm also very passionate as well, the notion of self-determination, specifically with indigenous people. Is the recognition of indigenous people right to self-determination enough, or does there need to be further steps past that recognition from the perspective of either government or just citizens in general? And do those steps include returning of land or having an opportunity to create self-governance? So what do you believe in terms of that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, recognition of anything in and of itself is never enough because, recognition is just a starting point for something else. So you recognize something with a view to trying to remedy it and rectify it. So in the context of indigenous peoples, recognizing a right to self-determination should require you to do many other things. And first of all, it requires an acknowledgement of the fact that there has been wrongdoing in the lives of indigenous peoples whose lands have been taken away and essentially whose lifestyle has been disrupted by the arrival of a settled state. Now, when that encounter first took place, that was an unequal discussion between indigenous peoples and settlers. That needs to be rectified in some shape or form, or a formula needs to be found for coexistence. None of that had really happened. So recognition of self-determination of indigenous peoples is, first of all, admitting that a violation occurred that needs to be remedied. But I think it necessarily is only the first point. Then you've got to look at the specific context in which any group anywhere live. Now, I should also say self-determination means many different things to many people. For some people, self-determination is the process by which you break away from an existing state and create your own new state. For instance, Eritrea broke away from Ethiopia and created a new state of Eritrea. South Sudan, more recently, broke away from Sudan to create a new state. But of course, Catalonia was unsuccessful in doing so from Spain. So self-determination means things like that, the political decision to govern yourselves. But self-determination could also mean autonomy. It could mean, for instance, in Canada, you've got Nunavut, which is an autonomous region where indigenous people self-govern. So it could mean like Nunavut, it could mean self-governance. It could also mean land restitution. New Zealand and the Waitangi Tribunal created a very, very formulaic and sophisticated process by which a group of people heard claims from indigenous peoples and determined what the remedy in law should be. So it's a variety of different avenues that you have available. But yes, self-determination is necessarily just the first point.
Right. So in the sense that self-determination is the first step, would we then, not necessarily that there's a formula for minority groups, especially in regards to indigenous people, but especially since there is such a strong connection to land and the significance of taking away one's land, is that also encompassed in the idea of self-determination?
So let me just put it this way. So self-determination essentially is the process by which a group determines what their political status should be and how they should pursue their human rights. For many, it's extremely controversial. And for many governments, the governments see it as a threat. So it's not every government that recognizes the right of self-determination in the way that I'm displaying. But rights, governments do recognize. So governments and legal systems all over the world recognize that every individual has the inherent dignity and rights, and that there needs to be a way in which they can access those rights. So that's an important starting point for any individual, whether they be minorities or indigenous peoples. The real challenge, though, is in how you make the rights that are legally available to everybody accessible in real terms. And that's where the challenge lies on the implementation side.
Right, exactly. And I know you gave a talk around 2 years ago speaking about how law needs to be a tool for accessibility rather than a tool that takes away one's rights. And you've mentioned that in 2015, I believe that the human rights agenda is slowly evolving to being more inclusive. So being a tool for that minority groups can have more accessibility to the law. Has that human rights agenda changed at all from what you've seen in your own work or around the world?
Yes, it has changed tremendously. Let me put it to you this way. In 1992, I worked as a journalist in India at the time. And of course, at the time, I was a fierce critique of the human rights agenda. It felt to me like it was a Western-oriented, individually based, legally acquired mechanism to guarantee people basic rights. And I critiqued for that vehemently. Also, I think in the context of the work I did in 1992 in Bombay, in one of the biggest cities in India, for a national newspaper, I remember covering a story on slum eviction. And I remember going to these slum dwellers and saying, don't worry, there's a law. You can challenge this in court. And I remember one of the slum dwellers turning around and looking at me with pity in his eyes and saying, son, you don't realize law is not for us. Law is for the rich people. Law essentially is not, we have no protection from the law. We don't know what it is. We don't have anyone who'll take the case. And it led me to really think this through. And if you think about law, it has been an instrument designed by the powerful to protect the interests of the powerful. I tell my students, I ask them to imagine a grainy picture of that Athenian democracy and say, imagine if somebody had a snapshot and a photograph. What would you notice about the people in that photograph? And you'd notice two things. One, they were all men. And two, they were all landowners. So there were no slaves and no women who could even participate. Now, these people sat around, and then one of the first tasks they had was the task of making laws. And guess what kinds of laws they made? Well, they made laws to protect their property. Right. And they made laws to protect their property from anybody else who sought to encroach it. So right at the heart of this discussion has been this problem. Yes, law is about creating the rules that govern society, but law is also about justice. And law is also about ensuring that everybody has access to those rules created in a fair manner. And of course, what human rights does, and this is where the key to the question, your question lies. What human rights does is it tries to say, well, this is about justice. We need to ensure that the inherent dignity and worth of every individual is respected. Now, we've known this since 1948 with the passage of the Universal Declaration in the aftermath of World War II. But essentially, the human rights agenda was very much a political governance agenda of a liberal democracy. We didn't pay attention to economic rights. We didn't pay attention to social rights. We certainly didn't pay attention to whether the legal rights we'd created were accessible. I think since the 1990s, what we've seen is greater awareness, for sure. Now, let me just say straight, I'm still not happy with where we are. There's still a long way to go. But in that period of time, between, say, 1992 and 2017, the human rights agenda has become broader, better recognized. Every single country in the world now, including North Korea, every single country in the world now has enough in their legal systems to talk about human rights. But the gaps remain, the implementation gaps. We are becoming more inclusive, but the journey is still long.
Right. So in regards to implementation, because I guess necessarily through working with human rights in the UN, not always is there a governing body internationally that can enforce a certain agenda of human rights onto countries. And I guess that's where the gap remains, is the fact that nations do have a responsibility to implementing equal human rights, but there isn't necessarily a governing body that has enough jurisdiction to implement and force human rights to the degree that we need it to be. And so I guess that's the issue that we're facing today, is that we're having these conversations, but it's how do we get nations to the degree of not just talking about it, but actually implementing it, right? It's getting to that, it's closing that gap, which is to have less, it's to actually give nations responsibility for any human rights atrocities that they have committed. And it's to make sure that other nations actually recognize the atrocities that their neighboring nations have done against their own people. right?
Yeah.
That's one way that we can, I guess, keep nations always on their feet to recognize human rights atrocities and also to make sure they're committing equal, fair human rights.
Yes, it's a good point. I mean, but let me just let me characterize it in the following way. Yes, it is true that the institutions at international level are weak. It's not fair to say there aren't any, because there's a UN Human Rights Council which does monitor states. There's an International Court of Justice which allows one state to take a complaint against other states. There are a series of human rights treaties that states are bound by and that states are monitored with. And there are a series of special measures that test the extent to which states are behaving well according to the norms created. So there are mechanisms, but you're absolutely right. They are weak. And they are weak, I think, partly because of political will. You know, this is not dissimilar to the issues we face on climate change. It's not the lack of institutions as much as the lack of political will to pursue it. There is also the difficulty then that different countries seem to prioritize different things. So if you talk to Russia about Chechnya, Russia will say to you, excuse me, look at the map, please. Chechnya is a part of Russia. This is not your business. You shouldn't interfere. So there is state sovereignty sometimes acts as an obstacle to talking about human rights too. But I would suggest to you that the better and the more robust way of doing this is to make sure that every country's national legal system can protect human rights. We don't particularly need a world policeman for this, because the world policemen, and they tend to be men as well, the world policemen tend to have their own interests at heart. So they don't necessarily believe, so they're not likely to react, for instance, with one of the greatest tragedies unfolding at the moment with the Rohingya. But the Rohingya don't have friends in high places. So even if there was a world policeman, the world policeman isn't going to go and try and attempt to solve it in the way that we would like to see to be able to protect the inherent dignity and worth of the Rohingya. Most people don't even know what's happening with them. So I think there are issues like that. So the stronger emphasis has to be at the national level to ensure that domestic courts, domestic systems, domestic populations are well aware of what the issues are. And this is where the role of civil society and the youth come in. That essentially not allowing states, not allowing institutions to get away with human rights violations is key. And I think especially in a world where we are so much more reactive to public pressure and so much more reactive to collective opinion, if we can mobilize that opinion with the correct facts, because we do live in this period where news is configured differently to suit different ends. But if we can find a way to genuinely explain to people why it is that we need to protect vulnerable groups from the kind of misdemeanors and gross violations they face, and then if we can use that to mobilize civil society, to talk to wider populations, wider groups, to ultimately influence the shape of government and institutions, this fight is winnable.
Exactly. So I have a couple of questions on what you just said. One of them being about how can youth get involved with human rights? So in regards to what you were just saying, that youth can have this way of participating by making sure that their own nations are upkeeping with, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals. So what are some ways that youth can really take an active role in human rights?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I'm very impressed by SDSN-Youth, and the energy that you have in your network and the range of people all around the world who follow this issue is a real source of hope. And frankly, Miriam, if we don't get the generations mobilized on this issue, we're lost. And I think partly it is true that we are hoping now for human ingenuity to solve these kinds of problems. It's very clear that my generation has failed in the quest to hold governments to account, and my generation has failed in being able to have enough inclusion, in being able to even design and imagine systems better. But I look at my children, and they are younger than you are, and younger than many of the people in your network are. But these children don't necessarily see division. They don't necessarily see gender-based issues in the same way that mine did. They don't necessarily see questions around trans as a difficulty. They have a different attitude. They are more conscious of the environment. They have a different mentality towards it. So I think it is crucial to have youth voices in all of these, because these are flavoring the debates. And I think youth are a key role. Now, how do you do it? First of all, my advice, and this is my advice to all my students across is be better informed about the world. Don't take what you get at face value from the news. Search deeper. You now are the agents of your own education, much more than my generation was. In my generation, somebody would talk to you about a textbook that was already 5 years out of date, and then they would bring their perspective onto it. I would say test it. Make sure that you operate on a strong knowledge base. Don't leave that global map unturned. You look at a global map and already we look at it from a Eurocentric perspective. Europe is in the middle. Why should Europe be in the middle of that map? Why couldn't Europe be in the West or the Far East? It depends on what perspective you have. But make sure when you look at that world map that you're fully aware of issues across the world. That's a knowledge challenge. You need to solve that knowledge challenge because we need a global attitude to solving these problems. That's the first step, I think. Now, that's an individual quest between an individual young person and a Google map and sources on the internet that may or may not be good. That's the first quest. The next is to find an area that you're passionate about. I think it is crucial to bear in mind that we all have comparative advantages in what we are interested in. Whatever you are interested in, the Sustainable Development Goals are broad enough for you to see a utility in doing something. The Sustainable Goals are not just statements of aspiration, they are actions, they are calls to action. I would say invest your time in understanding the one that speaks to you most. Maybe you're into education, maybe you're into health, maybe you're into gender equality, maybe you're into inequality in general, maybe you want to be an economist, maybe you want to understand how ecospheres work. Whatever it is, maybe you're interested in urban planning. Think through, this is where the jobs are going to be. And we need people with imagination who are widely educated. And I don't mean in terms of education at a university, which often is narrow. I mean widely educated. Inform yourself, knowledge is power. And then understand and look at people who you can admire, understand what skills you need, and invest in those skills. This is a long-term battle, and the long-term battle can be won through imagination. My key message is don't imagine the world in 2030 to look like the world in the past. If you imagine the world in the future to be like the past, we'll merely replicate it. We need a new design, and you need to think that design through. And I think you have already, because of the fact that you have so many channels of communication and you speak across so many boundaries, you already have the starting point of that. You've got that fledgling root or fledgling seed in a neat pot. Water it, make sure it grows, and make sure it grows in conjunction with other seedlings elsewhere, because that is the hope that we have.
Exactly. And I think you said a lot in terms of the simple ways that youth can get involved. And that is, for example, being a part of a network, being part of a system that wants to create actionable change. And it's reminding youth that, as you said before, that no matter at what level they are, either a student or if they are already at the career level of being in a job, that there's no chance. There's always a chance, not that there's no chance. There is always a chance to get involved. And as you said, the Sustainable Development Goals, they're not just assumptions, or they're not just there for you to look at. Rather, they're actually steps in which we can accomplish change. And I think this leads to another question that I have, and it's regarding the issue of climate change. So from my own understanding and my own education, we haven't looked at how climate change is actually affecting human rights. And I think especially now with the fact that there is such high migration of people who are either like the Rohingya Muslims or with the Syrian refugee crisis, who are fleeing geographically from a lot of human rights atrocities. Would you say that climate change and human rights go hand in hand?
They absolutely do, Mariam. And I would say that, in a sense, some people who talk about climate change as something happening in the future, climate change has been impacting human rights already for the last 2 decades at least. Much of the Middle Eastern crises can be explained by the lack of water and resources. And of course, inevitably, vulnerable people are forced to flee. And when vulnerable people flee and the state and the international community can't uphold their rights, we don't just get individual violation, we get a violation at a gross scale. We're talking gross human rights violations. We're talking about ethnic cleansing. We're talking about all of those worst things. If you look at the UN Charter, when 1945, the kind of the people who stood on the ruins of Europe and tried to build this new international organization, they started off by promising that never the scourge of warfare would affect us in our lifetimes. Well, it has. It is. And that dream, in a sense, lies shattered. But the idea is still there. And climate change is a major contributing factor to this. Essentially, the world's rich are depleting the resources at such an incredible rate that there isn't room for enough people to live and enough people to survive on, based on 10 years ago's population figures. And the population is still growing. So it's a major problem, absolutely.
Right. And then going based off of this, so because there's so much change geographically that is happening around the world, whether it be people migrating to different parts of the world or climate change affecting individuals' home, and do you believe then, because there's so much change that is happening in our environment, there needs to be multiple ways that the Sustainable Development Goals can be applied? Because not only is there geographical changes, but there's also different ways for people to access human rights and the law. So would you say that there are many different ways that we can apply the Sustainable Development Goals?
Absolutely. I mean, the word on that, the one word answer on that is complexity. That
Right.
The world is complex. There aren't simple solutions. And I think partly we've put ourselves into the political situation we've put ourselves by electing these leaders who are telling us that the world is simple. And they're saying, well, you don't like Mexicans? Well, I have an answer to you. Vote me, I'll build a wall. So there's a bit of this understanding, this portrayal out there that everything is really simple. It's like an app on a phone. You swipe right and the problem will all be magically solved. Actually, it's increasingly and incredibly complex. And being able to understand that complexity means investing time in context-specific situations and understanding solutions in those context-specific situations. We need to avoid the mistake of thinking, well, here's an answer I have in relation to your previous question. I'm just going to repeat that for this question, and I don't care if it doesn't make sense. And I think that we need to understand how that complexity can be tackled, and it can only be tackled by looking at it in a context-specific way.
Mm-hmm. And then with what you were saying about context, because there's so many differences between Western-based nations such as Canada versus countries in Latin America, for example, just dealing with our history, dealing with our population sizes. And because of that, I think also what you were saying is that we need to take context into consideration when thinking about a country's development. And
Absolutely.
yes, exactly. Like something that I'm currently studying is the fact that one of the theories is that we don't think about a country's history when we think about labeling them. We rather just assume based off of what their current state is that they are developing or that they are considered third world because they are not to the degree that we expect them to be. And so I think this also has a lot to do with the Sustainable Development Goals, is that we have to take in consideration what our country's histories, either with colonialism or access to foreign aid, right? So I think there's a lot to also be said on that, and also in terms of research of just how human rights can be, and SDGs can be applied when taking into consideration a country's history.
Yeah, without a doubt, which is why when you asked me about how to get involved, my answer was to start with knowledge, start with understanding context. We need to understand the way in which these problems are located and the theater in which they are located. We then need to understand what is the virtuous chain that needs to be set in store for the problem to be solved. And that necessarily means that we have to start with an almost encyclopedic understanding of what the problem is. And we need to think about, almost on an encyclopedic level, of what the potential solutions might be. And we need to start cross-relating them. And that's complex. And that is tedious work. It's not here's a bunch of political scientists at Harvard. They've got the ultimate governance system. Why don't we just turn up in a plane to various places and dump it and it'll work? It won't work. It hasn't worked. We've seen that. And this is what we've learned in my generation. This idea that you could take democracy and force it down somebody's throat and hope it would be the answer. But actually, democracy can be imported, but rarely does it work when it's exported. People can choose to adopt a system. People can choose to adopt a system based on popular consent. You can't force people to do it. Just like people can choose to be secular, you can't force secularity upon them. And I think those are the kinds of aspects we have to learn, that there are different nuances, and those nuances are crucial to understanding whether any policy measure can succeed or fail. And I'm saying to you as youth, understand that nuance, engage with that nuance, make it into a science, explain it to yourselves, understand what the solutions might be, figure out what the chain is, who are the actors in that chain, which level do you want to be an actor in, how do you want to contribute to this goal. I think that's the key.
Mm-hmm. And I think something you said was really important in regards to youth knowing that there, as we said before, there isn't a limit of where they can get involved in this level of creating change, actually applying and acting upon the sustainable development goals. Yeah. And so something you said before was that we have the solutions within us. And meaning that we have the possibility of creating change. What, if you can explain a little bit more about what you meant, that we have the solutions in us, that we are the ones who can create change in the society that we want to see in 2030?
Yeah. So let me put it in a few different examples then. I think one way in which you can create the change, if you are technologically minded and scientifically oriented, working on the science of the solutions is crucial. Mm-hmm. We need solutions that are sophisticated. We don't have enough. We absolutely don't have enough in the past that will inform us in terms of how we deal with the future challenges. So we need people who are technicians, who understand that, who have the skills. So that's a skills-based role that youth can play, engage with it, make sure you have the sophisticated skills. There's another one there with regards to influencing people, a wider influencing people, campaigning. It is very important that youth campaign for that. It's a classic example. I live at the moment in London, and if London had a wider demographic of people who could participate in the Brexit election, in the Brexit referendum, there was no way we would have had Brexit, because the youth were not for it, because the youth didn't see the point of this very, very old-fashioned attempt at understanding what a nation state was. So there's a campaigning element there that is important. And then there's an educational element, and there's an educational element with regards to making sure that you disseminate this knowledge across the education system. But there's also an active one, getting involved with civil society, understanding how civil society works. So there are several different strands of activity that are available. And frankly, they would suit every type of person within your network. It's not just, you've got to be a super smart mathematician, otherwise you can't work on the sustainable development goals. It's not, you've got to be extremely articulate to work on the legal side. It's not. There's a range of different roles there. And everybody within your movement who's committed to sustainable development has a role to play within this. And you need to work out what that niche is. And I would encourage you to link in better with the SDSN to ask people those kinds of questions. Say, look, here's my skill set. This is what I'd like to do. What guidance could you give us? And remember, our guidance is limited to the world in which we have imagined. You can imagine a different world, and you can actually create. And I say this to some of my students, that our challenge as educators now is the fact that many of our students are going to end up in jobs that have not yet been created. We have not had the imagination to create them. So we need to equip young people with the skill to be able to create the jobs that they are going to go into. Because the old-fashioned traditional jobs, well, they're depleting.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I think also that something that our generation, the upcoming generation, is realizing is the fact that the opportunity to get involved in human rights and in sustainable change is not only changing in the fact of the means to getting involved, but also the career options of how one can get involved. And so there are more career options, not necessarily through university, as you said before, but there are more actionable ways that are outside of the university college realm in which youth can get involved in sustainable careers. So in your experience, what have some of those careers encompassed?
Yeah. So one of the biggest areas, I work in law, and one of the biggest areas clearly is environmental law, which really didn't exist a decade ago. It did in a very, very small sense. lawyers, tort lawyers looking to sue companies. But environmental law is a huge area now that has emerged. But also what has emerged are areas like intellectual property rights, because there are increasingly now nuggets of intellectual property that are genuinely useful to solve global problems at scale. I'm talking about indigenous cultures here that may have particular herbs, that may have particular ways of life that could be useful. So how do you protect that? How do you enhance protection for it in such a way that the community benefits? There are all of these kinds of challenges. So that's just in the area of law. But there's also area in local governance. Increasingly, local governance needs to look at a whole series of different questions on how to configure this. There are massive issues arising in terms of housing, urban housing. How are you going to house urban poor as and when they come to the cities to live? How are you going to create the technology to guarantee labor rights? So there's a huge area. This is far from the traditional, well, I'm going to go to law school, then I'm going to work for a multinational corporation, and then I'm going to hope that I make enough money. That used to be one of the routes. That route still exists. But there are a whole range of other, and that's just from one area. That's just talking about it from law. But in the context of other areas, political science, sociology now increasingly needs to understand how you can use data to explain social relations in an urban space. The world is getting increasingly urbanized. How are those power relations being configured? Do we have data to measure it? Is there ways in which you can challenge some of that data? How do you use data on traffic to regulate traffic flows better? So there are so many new areas that weren't given much airtime before that are increasingly going to be viable career options for people.
So, like, as you said before, not only is the law evolving, but the ways that people can get involved with the law are also evolving with it.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So, just to, I guess, engage with the audience, someone had a question, which is, transitional justice trumps human rights justice. Which level of peace at national level with international standards?
Yeah,
So,
it's a good question. And again, it's very hard to give a general answer. So transitional justice for me is a process by which you make the transition, as it says, from what was an authoritarian, perhaps an aggressive regime that denied rights, to one that respects the rule of law and generates human rights. So transitional justice is necessarily a process. Human rights, I would argue, is the outcome. So human rights is when you finish that process, you have human rights. Now, of course, you should also have human rights in transitional justice processes. But here's a big dilemma. So let's imagine you have, and I'm not going to name names, let's imagine you have a nasty dictator who is running a country. We had one recently in Africa that you may recall that has just stepped down now. But imagine that you had a nasty dictator, and the only way to guarantee that nasty dictator to step down was to give him immunity. Say, look, I know you've done all these things, you've killed all these people. Please, we will guarantee your immunity. Please step down. That's the question. That's where that questioner's question, I think, becomes so relevant. Is it okay to say you've killed all these people, you get away scot-free? That's transitional justice, perhaps? Or is it important to say, no, I don't really care. We need you to step down, but we're going to also nail you for what you did. And I think that's where you have those difficulties. And it's true, in transitional justice processes, very often compromises have been made. And those compromises have been made with a view in the short term to getting the change. But in the long term, you have to then put in human rights mechanisms. Obviously, it's better not to let the perpetrators of gross human rights violations get away scot-free, obviously. But sometimes the situation is such that there's no other way you can get the change other than compromising. So this is really context specific. This is why I said you can't give a general answer to that question. Both play an important role. Without the transitional justice mechanism, you don't get the transition. That means the gross human rights violations continue on a large scale. But once you've got that transition, if you don't quickly put in place measures to ensure the inherent dignity and worth of every individual is protected, well, you can get back into the kind of situation that led you to need the transition in the first place.
Right. And as you said before, we were talking about how when remembering what is encompassing of a nation's law, we have to also remember their history and background. So transitional justice, as you said before, can be on a whole spectrum if we are looking at it from a certain country's perspective, right? Yeah. So if in Canada, something that I would say may be a way of transitional justice if it's actually followed through, is the truth and reconciliation recommendations.
Yeah.
And so that is one way that the Canadian government can transition through to actually accomplishing justice for Indigenous people in Canada.
Of course, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And a second question is, where and how can the youth learn more about human rights in a meaningful context?
Yeah. Well, obviously, this is a perfect opportunity for me to plug my human rights, human wrongs course, which I do with Sarah Bradshaw, and which is hosted by Chiteshri Devi in the SDSN office in New Delhi. So obviously, please do look at that, because it tries to set out what is quite a global take on human rights. But how do you learn about human rights? Well, you learn about human rights from understanding some of the victim stories in each country. You understand it by trying to understand, you learn it by trying to understand the stories that didn't get told. Mm-hmm. You try to understand it by looking at organizations that are trying to push for accountability. There are a range of actors out there in the broader world in which everybody lives in that act in favor of human rights, that try to look at it. Now, at the biggest, at the highest level, I guess, at the international level, you have NGOs like Amnesty International, which is a membership-based organization, which does focus on global human rights. You've also got Human Rights Watch. In fact, if you look it up, yesterday was Human Rights Day, mm-hmm. and many of the buildings went blue in recognition of the need for human rights. So Human Rights Watch do a lot of campaigning work, and they too are in every country. But of course, even Greenpeace do work on human rights. Of course, their main focus is on the environment, but they do work on human rights. Minority Rights Group International, if you're particularly interested in minority issues in every country, MRG as it's called, Minority Rights Group International, focus a lot on these issues. So there are a range of different international NGOs that operate across the field. There are a range of national NGOs that operate across the field. There are actors. There are very often top quality investigative journalists who are interested in these issues. There are books written about it. A simple Google search will give you a huge amount.
Right.
But of course,
there's a lot of
courses that I recommend the strongest. You'd expect.
Yeah, the course. For sure. The course by SDG Academy. There's a lot of information. There are a lot of opportunities to learn from those courses, since there is professors such as you who are being able to speak about and actually give an agenda and a syllabus of how to understand human rights from a varied perspective, which is very important.
Yeah.
And so I think this leads into how we want to see 2030 in regards to human rights policy. And that is, in fact, as you said before, is that at the core of human rights, we need to make sure there is an inclusive society. And that is how I think, I think you said this, that human rights will evolve in the way that we want it to, is that if we have this inclusivity, then not only will we have an opportunity for perspectives to be heard, that, for example, of minority groups, but also there is going to be great opportunities for there to be chances of communication at a national level. So would you say that's one of the main pillars in order for human rights law to really evolve in the way that we need it to for 2030, for example?
Absolutely. I mean, and I think the inclusivity test for me is the one that there are very few guarantees in life, but the fact that you have a more inclusive set of people who are coming to decisions is the best guarantee you can that you've covered all the angles. So for a start, the world in 2030, I would like to see world parliaments that are at least 50-50 on women's participation, or as close to it as possible. I would want to see boardrooms with more women. That's a start already, because that already means that the decisions that come out are likely to, not necessarily, not as a consequence, because we don't necessarily need women to be on these things to represent women. That might be good, but essentially we need perspectives. We need width in our perspectives. One of the problems is that everything that we do in the year 2017 is narrow. It's narrow because it's governed by a very, very small proportion of the population. And they are almost all male, and they are almost all from privileged backgrounds. And that's a problem, because increasingly they are disconnected from the lived experience of the other 99. And if the 1% are the only ones who are making decisions for the 99, the quality of those decisions is likely to be flawed. So at a very, very start, at a very, very basic level, that inclusivity guarantees that the quality of decision making is enhanced to pay attention to the whole range of people affected by the decisions. So if there was one thing I would want, it would be that, absolutely.
Right.
And I think even through the lens of just gender, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but I mean if it was 50-50 or close to 50-50, you're already improving the decision-making quality hugely. Then it would be important to make sure that that was also representative of the wider society, of the minority, indigenous peoples, to the extent that indigenous peoples want to participate. You can't force anybody to participate. But I think that just as a one single panacea, if you could have bodies that were decision-making, that were more inclusive, I would feel that the quality of that decision is likely to be wider. The context is wider and the impact is wider. And that could be one important element, yes.
Right. And recently, I was actually at a talk within my university, and we had a very diverse panel. And one of the things that we came out with was that in order for, I guess, transitional justice and human rights and there to be more investment in minority groups, there needs to be that minority voice in the government at the national level. So as you said before, we need to have this parity to allow not only for there to be gender parity, but also parity in terms of ethnicity, age, and having that perspective will allow, I guess, not even policy to change, but also the way that countries will be investing in their own people.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, it gives you a chance. Now, with minorities, and again, with older people or other groups, there is a problem. And the problem essentially is that if you think of democracy as a game of numbers, well, you never need to worry about the minority. And increasingly, and certainly the populist contests we have seen on your continent and this continent I'm in now, and in Asia and in everywhere else, if you see democracy as a game of numbers, then essentially you never need to worry about minority voices at all. But we have to remember that democracy was not just a game of numbers, it was a game of values. Yes, those values have to have the consent of the wider population, but you start with values. When you disconnect the values from the numbers, you get the kinds of crazy anomalies you get, where essentially you get the big rich daddy who promises ice cream to everybody, who ends up being the class monitor. Not because the class monitor has any ideas on how to maintain order in a class or how to increase representation. It's just he wants to be the class monitor, and he has enough candy to give around, and all the kids will vote for the rich, sometimes bully, because they're scared of him. So you have that classic example by how democracy, when not configured around value systems, can give you the kinds of results that we are seeing across the political space now.
Right. And I think then this goes on the point that not when we are making these changes in policy and human rights, we can't just always take it from a Eurocentric perspective. We have to implement these policies that are going to be fit to create development that the country needs based off of their own history and customs and backgrounds. And remembering that is just so important, because we won't get to the degree that we need if we just keep implementing the same framework over and over.
Let me give you an example, a little story. So imagine you're walking down a street, or you're walking down a street, and you see somebody has been hit, on a road, and they're lying down there. And obviously your first concern is what's going to happen to them. And then suddenly you hear sirens and you think, oh, it's okay, the ambulance is here. Now imagine the ambulance pulls up, and out of the back of the ambulance jump two dentists. And you're thinking, dentists? What are they doing here? The guy's been hit, his spleen is ruptured. He needs proper medical attention. And the dentists say, yes, but everything is to do with dental hygiene. We fix his teeth first. We'll worry about that a little bit later. You might think, what's the relevance of the story? The relevance of the story is the way in which we posited solutions before in the human rights world was simple. You need to eliminate the death penalty. You need to have political participation. You need to have good governance. And we were sending this stuff to countries all around the world. And countries were saying, yeah, we'll get to that. But actually, we need to understand how to generate food. We need to guarantee people clothing, shelter. Because the fact that we'd configured the human rights system very much in Europe, and those issues were not were not important because they'd been taken for granted, we didn't design systems for it. But we went out there and sold the stuff, and it was a bit like selling dentistry to a man or woman that was lying on the floor bleeding to death. So it had little utility. And I'm not saying dental hygiene isn't a good thing. We should all probably practice it. But in the world of prioritizing things, perhaps there were other priorities that needed to be addressed, and we simply didn't have the solution. But instead of listening and assessing what you need in that area at that particular time, if you have a preordained solution, where basically whenever there's a problem, somebody turns up in an ambulance and they're dentist, then you've got a problem because you've got the wrong solution for the wrong problem. And I think listening and contextualizing and understanding that it needs skill to solve it is important. And I think that's where we are now. We at least are beginning to understand what the underlying issues are. Now, let me put it straight. I don't mean that you should prioritize economic, social, and cultural rights above everything else, but they have to go hand in hand. So just because you have a famine doesn't give you the right to kill your political opponents, clearly. You need to put them together hand in hand, and you need to come up with a holistic solution that is needs-based, response to need, and not just here's a formula of one I cooked earlier, I'm going to just apply the same formula again. And that's why that Eurocentric approach was so limited in perpetrating better human rights globally.
Right. And I think something that it just reminds me with the word holistic, I'm currently in a program of indigenous studies, and what they say is that when they're looking at the world, and not even at themselves, but in their community, we need to take holistic ways of how we are going to approach change. That we can't just go on with, for example, things like the death penalty. Rather, there are other ways to move forward to have development that are not so black and white.
Exactly.
Right? And I think my last question will be, do you feel as though, with your own experience, of course, there needs to be a reorientation of how nations are investing in human rights?
Yeah, it's a difficult one to answer.
Mm-hmm.
You saved your most difficult question to the end of it.
I'm sorry.
One to answer, because I think it does depend on what you mean by investing in human rights.
Right.
So I would say, people will disagree with this. So people would say, yes, they need to invest more in human rights. They need to create more democratic institutions. Is that true? Yes, it's true. People need to invest more in human rights. They need to improve the accountability of their police force. Is that true? Yes, it's true. People need to invest more in human rights by ensuring that gender-based parity is crucial to the society. Is that true? Yes. So the reason I say that to you is because there are absolutely a gamut of options that investment can be used for. Should there be more on human rights in general? Answer for me, yes. I'm biased. I'm a human rights lawyer. I would obviously want more in that particular field, because when I look at the perspective when I look at the globe through the human rights lens, I see violations everywhere, and I see lack of accountability and lack of implementation. So for me, implementation has to be the biggest priority, followed by accountability for that implementation. So absolutely the answer is yes. Where you would disagree is, so where do you start with? Do you fix your police force first? Yes, you do. If your police force is out there being a menace to society and only looking after the rich, then fix that first. But if, on the other hand, your politicians are all corrupt, and that is a major issue because public funds that should be doing good are being drained into Swiss bank accounts, then that becomes the priority. Right. At the same time, see, when you take this prioritization approach, what you will often find is that then issues like gender parity tend to be far away, because you say, well, my house is on fire now, I don't need to worry about that. So it has to be done side by side. There has to be a medium and a long-term vision for what society is going to be, and a commitment to that. And there has to be a let's fix the short-term problem here and now. And those are not incompatible, because part of it is just about creating enough of a mentality where you genuinely believe, as I do now, that the inherent dignity of every individual is important, and that every individual has potentially something to contribute, that we need to make sure we collectively create the opportunity for them to do so. They may choose not to do so, and that's their choice. But we shouldn't turn them away because we weren't imaginative enough in how to create that opportunity. That's the challenge we face.
Right. So, as you said before, just as a final statement to this question, that there's so much evolving every day, whether it be technology or the means to share what is occurring. there is always an opportunity to have new creative frameworks to addressing human rights. And I think this is one of the biggest lessons so far that I've learned this year, is the fact that we have to remember what is the perspective of the people that are being affected, and not just the perspective of those who want to implement the policies.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So before we end off, is there any final statements that you would like to make?
I would encourage you. I mean, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, Miriam. And I'm delighted to know that you're working on indigenous people's issues. I think we need more people more young people with energy and passion and the obvious skills that you have to be working on these kinds of issues. I would just encourage everybody within your network to look at those SDGs, think through what your skill sets are, and think through how you can plug into it. You are the ones who are going to either have all the answers already or in the process of unearthing them. You need to be able to push our generation, my generation, you need to be able to push your political systems to ensure that those goals are uppermost in implementation. Because we are too stuck in short term. Even our political systems, we elect people for 4 years, 5 years. They don't need to worry about what will happen in 10. They're just looking at short-term expediencies. Or everything we have is geared towards short-termism. And that short-termism, by its definition, excludes you. You need to make sure you're included. And the only way you can in the SDG frame is perfect, because it's talking about a world in 2030. And it's talking about the creating the wherewithal for a world in 2050. You are the custodians of that legacy. You need to be able to ensure that your voices are heard, that your legitimate questions are asked. And you may have some questions that are not legitimate, but ask them anyway. You have a right to do so, and push people to give you meaningful answers. I hope that I have given you some meaningful answers on that, but I would encourage you to keep doing that and to configure for yourselves careers and to configure work that is meaningful. The biggest pleasure you can have in your life is to be able to work on something you're passionate about. I would encourage you to find that passion. I would hope that the range of targets and indicators that are attached to the 17 goals will give you plenty to think through and really invest in the knowledge and do it in a global, collaborative way. That's crucial to winning this fight, but it is winnable. And it's winnable because of the energy and passion that you will display. And hopefully you will find some role for us in that context too.
For sure. Thank you so much for speaking with me. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I think not only myself, but I was able to ask a lot of questions that I've wanted to ask someone who's working in human rights. And thankfully, we've had a lot of interaction with the audience as well. So thank you so much. And I hope you have an amazing rest of the day.
And let's make 2018 a good one as well.
Yes. Have a great day.
Pleasure. Thank you.